as we just look at him being congratulated and thanked there in the chamber. Also joining us at the moment, North America correspondent Craig McMurtry. He's still with us, of course, in Washington and has been watching that speech as well. And Geoffrey Garrett is with us too, the Chief Executive of the US Studies Centre. He's with us in Sydney. Gentlemen, great to have you both on. Craig, I'm going to start with you. Your first impressions of that speech?
I think the speech was bigger, more of a statement than a lot of people were expecting. There was a struggle here, I suppose, about whether it was going to be safe, whether he was only going to reach for the common ground, things that were bipartisan. Democrats were certainly urging the President of the White House to go bold, and he really did re-prosecute some things that have, some battles that have already been fought and lost, closing tax loopholes that favour the rich, for example, talking about delivering a jolt to the economy, modernising thousands of schools, hiring more teachers. And I think one of the debating points, one of the grapple holds, if you like, in the political debate that will follow from this will be whether it's too much for Republicans, whether they will say it was another stimulus package, it's too political, and it wasn't really about finding common ground.
Geoffrey Garrett, that is what the President was trying to do in the speech, clearly, because he used that phrase himself about taking the politics out of the situation. Do you think he successfully managed to do that in a way that he might be able to make this bill palatable to Republicans?
Virginia, I actually don't. I think he said that he was speaking mostly to Republicans. I don't think that was the case. I think Barack Obama today was speaking to the American people, the old Ronald Reagan tactic of going over the heads of Congress to the American people. What he's trying to do is to paint the Tea Party Republicans in particular as just out of the mainstream. Their ideas are too radical, and Barack Obama is the sensible centre. He's not a wild leftist. Now, will that work? Well, in the short term, I would expect the Republicans in Congress to say, as Craig suggested, that they cannot pass this law because the only thing it'll do is increase the deficit, and they're committed not to doing that. So, you know, you'd expect in the short term that, for example, the financial markets that don't like this political fighting will react negatively. I don't know whether it'll have any impact on the jobs picture, supposedly the big story here. To my mind, this was the first speech of Barack Obama's re-election campaign.
And just a quick comment from both of you gentlemen before we move down to the details of the speech. Your impressions there, Geoffrey, of how he delivered that speech, the presence that he gave, the figure of the man that he cut. How did he come across?
I think it was a pretty impressive, it was a tough Barack Obama who, again, as he has done for years, appealed to Americans' higher values. You know, we're better than this, we're bigger than this. But he did it in a way that really had a steely jaw resolve to the Republicans. I think there's a criticism of Obama, particularly from the left, that says that he has ceded the political bully pulpit to the Republicans in the last 6 to 9 months, and it's been all about reducing government. That's their solution to the problem. He's trying to gain back that bully pulpit and say that there is a sensible role for a government, not only in America's short-term challenges, getting people back to work, but its long-term challenges as well, staying number one in the 21st century.
Craig McMurtry, much of the discussion as Barack Obama headed into the Capitol to make this speech was that he was a weakened president and one whose popularity is very, very low. Did he seem to actually turn that around to the impression that he gave in giving this speech, in your view?
Well, he's always very good at these set pieces. I mean, he's a master of delivering the big speech, and certainly the atmospherics as he entered that room, particularly at the hands of the Democrats, were pretty positive. But there was still plenty of evidence of that partisan divide. There were a number of times when it was only Democrats on their feet applauding. I took note, Republicans came to their feet when he talked about incentives to hire veterans, when he talked about doing more to reform the corporate tax code, and particularly when he talked about getting real about the cost and the need to put Medicare and Medicaid on a more sustainable footing. But there was still that partisan divide. It was also interesting, just picking up on Geoffrey's point there, there was one moment where he did really go to this idea, this Tea Party notion. The way out of this is, as he said in his speech, to simply cut government spending and eliminate most government regulations. Now, he was certainly reaching for the American audience rather than the political audience with that. It was notable that there was some applause and there was some cheering from Republican hardliners, if you will. But speaking Speaker John Boehner sat there behind the President, and he was certainly not applauding. I think there is an awareness in the Republican establishment, this danger of prosecuting that message in an extreme way.
So, Craig, staying with you and the details of that speech, you ran through a few of the key subject areas a moment ago, but the payroll tax holiday is one in particular that he's hoping can be extended, that's in place at the moment. Will the Republicans get on board with that one?
They're likely to get on board with that. They're likely to get on board with a number of the measures he spoke about. The payroll tax cut is the obvious one. Tax credits for veterans that we've already spoken about. But I think what will happen here is that it'll be interesting to see how they decide to strategise this. I mean, the Republicans, whether or not they pick apart the passages that they are prepared to support that deal directly with creating jobs, and they want to set aside everything else in some way, or whether they simply want to stake out territory, which would be politically potentially quite dangerous for them, of saying that the President overreached, that it's going to cost too much, that he didn't really lay out. I think one of the weaknesses here is he's really putting the funding of this all on the super committee that has to go away and identify cuts, 1.2 trillion, now more than that. He's saying it's up to them to identify the cuts in this, though interestingly he also promised a bolder deficit reduction plan in the next couple of weeks. I think that's interesting too.
Then, Geoffrey Garrett, you mentioned just before that the President was speaking over the heads of Congress and to the American people, but nonetheless there were some repeated, very direct appeals to Republican members of Congress. If you were playing a drinking game this morning using the phrase "pass this bill," we'd all be drunk by now, wouldn't we, Geoffrey?
Yeah, we would, but I think Craig's right that, you know, the immediate $450 billion or whatever it is in this American Jobs Act has a chunk in there that looks like tax cuts, extending tax cuts led by the payroll tax, as you said. But the difficult part for the Republicans is going to be the two big spending measures in there. So one is about infrastructure, roads, bridges, etc., you know, shades of Kevin Rudd and shovel-ready projects that are going to put construction workers back to work. And the second one is giving money to states and cities in the US that basically would pay for more teachers, more healthcare workers and the like. And, you know, if the bill on that's a couple of $100 billion and the total package here is $400 to $450 billion, I think what the Republicans are going to say is, listen, Barack Obama spent $800 billion, convinced us to spend $800 billion in early 2009 on fiscal stimulus, and it had no impact on the jobs picture. We're in a worse position today than we were then, so why should we throw more good money after bad? I think Craig's right that the real question is whether the Republican position will now seem outside the mainstream and too ideological. So that's a political question. You know, I think we should be asking the economic question. Will this turn the jobs situation around? You know, you can't see it in the short term. And I also, as I said, I think the number of set pieces where Republicans and Democrats are going to be fighting over the economy in the US, not only this jobs bill, they're supposed to pass a budget by the end of the month. That won't happen. The super committee has to report in. They've got a balanced budget amendment. All that's going to happen in the next 2 months. And you'd expect the financial markets, which are already incredibly nervous, to be even more volatile as a reaction to the fact that this political infighting in Washington looks like it's going to intensify. The debt ceiling debate wasn't the end of that. In many respects, it was the beginning of the political debates.
And just staying with you for a moment, Geoffrey Garrett, on that point of the economics of it, there were elements of that speech that almost seemed, I mean, clearly they were appealing to the American people and many members of Congress, but almost antique in the sense of talking about American cars being driven by South Koreans, that they export there rather than the other way around. I mean, it was a call to an American manufacturing tradition that really many have almost written off.
Yeah, and of course that's so interesting given what's been going on in Australia. What Obama was really talking about there was signing a free trade deal with Korea that Bush negotiated but has been hung up and not voted on by Congress ever since. Yeah. You know, I think the Obama administration hopes they can get it through. I just don't see how Congress at the moment would pass a free trade bill, because when unemployment is high, Americans are nervous about free trade, and typically they go for free trade deals for national security reasons. So that one might have been a bridge too far, but Obama did pick up on the fact that now the Republican Party in Congress has passed its own budget that would essentially privatise Medicare. Rick Perry, the leading candidate, the leading Republican candidate for president, just yesterday attacked Social Security, and Barack Obama said, I'm going to defend, come hell or high water, the fundamental elements of the American welfare state. And that's why, you know, that was the big political message to me. This had a short term but also a long term. It's the future of the country and why Barack Obama should be re-elected.
And Craig McMurtry, just finally returning to you for a last couple of comments. When it comes to the cost of this program, and clearly an appeal there to the Republicans that it's not going to cost any more money, it won't add to the deficit, it's funded in itself. Is that really going to be a strong appeal to them? Will it persuade them in some senses?
I don't think it is going to persuade them. I think that is one of the weaknesses here, that really all of that is being put on the super committee. It's really adding to the burden on that super committee to come up with these substantial savings, though he is, of course, as we mentioned before, flagging his own deficit reduction plan, a bigger, bolder one, in the weeks ahead. I think also that he was definitely reaching out to the Democrat base. We shouldn't forget that there's been, just as his approval ratings have been sagging, there's been some concern on the Democrat side, of course, that he looks far more vulnerable now than he did a few months ago. So he was really throwing out some red meat messages there, indicating that he was prepared to keep prosecuting some of the battles that have been tried before and haven't succeeded. And the other thing that's worth noting here is in the lead up to the speech, the Republican leadership was quite carefully using expressions like finding common ground, a new era of civility. So they've obviously got the message as well, because just as Barack Obama's approval ratings have been sagging, Republicans in Congress are even less popular.
Look, Craig McMurtry and Geoffrey Garrett, really great to have you both on board this morning for analysis of that important speech. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Virginia.
Okay.